My somewhat busy outline, if you just look toward the bottom of it, we've been looking at the path of humility and service, and 3 points we've covered so far: humility in the kingdom, latitude, and rectitude. If you could combine all those together, I would call the 3 of them together the principle of humble service, the principle of it. And now we move to another 3 little stories, which I'm going to call the practice of humble service. Let's get real. Let's see how this actually works out in the life on the street that we're called to live. And not surprisingly, the first place where humble service is going to be highlighted is in those relationships that are the most intimate. It's not humble service to someone 3,000 miles away at first. It's the person who's 3 inches away, the person who's right next to me, because sometimes it's easiest to bypass that person when it comes to humble service. And so we're going to begin with this most deep and intimate relationship of marriage. From there we move to children, and the text about suffer the little children to come unto me, that's next week. And then we move to possessions, the rich young ruler, how I use my entire life, including my possessions, to be engaged in this life of service. So that's kind of the basic agenda as it unfolds here. We hear that Jesus arose, came to the region of Judea by the other side of the Jordan. Multitudes were with him, and as he was accustomed, he taught them again. The there from which he arose is Capernaum. That's where they arrived after Caesarea Philippi. He's heading for Judea, for the capital Jerusalem. He is, after all, the king, and he's going to the capital. This is a visitation. It's an inspection. He's going to put the religious leadership, the trustees of the religion of Israel, on trial. They thought they were trying him. No, other way around. He's trying them, and he's heading to Jerusalem for that express purpose. But we hear that he goes on the other side of the Jordan. Luke tells us he came to the outskirts of Samaria and was rebuffed by Samaritans. Mark doesn't mention that, but Luke gives us more data. We don't know why the Samaritans prevented him from entering. Maybe it was the general hostility between Jews and Samaritans. Maybe it was particular hostility toward Jesus. This is where John and James wanted to call fire down from heaven and incinerate those people, turn them into grease spots. That was their solution. Jesus said, no, I don't think so, guys. Let's instead cross over the Jordan. This was a common bridge that was used by Jewish people precisely to avoid Samaria, a bridge at Scythopolis, and then they made the trip through Perea on the east side of the Jordan River, crossing back over at a bridge near Jericho. That's where, of course, we run into Zacchaeus as he's heading for Jerusalem, passing through Jericho. And so that's the rather circuitous route that he takes, but it was also common in those days. We hear that multitudes were with him, probably many of them simply going to Jerusalem because it's going to be Passover, and people made that trip customarily. But we have the impression many of these people were following Jesus expecting fireworks. Here is the great miracle worker of Galilee now going to Jerusalem, and there is a widespread expectation that this is going to be spectacular, to say the least, and they don't want to miss the show. Jesus tries to disabuse them of this, we hear in other gospel accounts. Nevertheless, many of these folks wouldn't hear of it. They thought this was going to be a great expression of God pouring out his power politically there in that place. Luke says the crowds were so unruly at this point they were trampling each other. Mark doesn't mention that because he's more interested in how Jesus has had a tendency to calm the crowd. So a little bit of a different agenda between the two, but one way or another, he taught them. He taught the crowds, but he also was teaching the disciples. What we said sometime earlier, this was like graduate school for the disciples. And the first topic under discussion now on this journey is marriage. It actually is precipitated by a bait question from the Pharisees. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? It's a question intending to create a problem, a dilemma for Jesus, probably intended to embarrass Jesus. Mark doesn't mention it, but the crux of the question is highlighted by Matthew, because the crux of it is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And that's implied in the question in Mark, but Matthew actually clarifies it a bit. The question is precipitated by a rather convoluted text from Deuteronomy 24. Hang on to your hats. This is all one sentence. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that's an abomination for the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. All right, there's a whole lot going on in there. But the actual debate was over one particular phrase that had become rather a significant debate in the scholarly circles of ancient Israel. It was a theological question, a question of biblical interpretation, and it had to do with this matter of what is the justification for a man dismissing his wife. It was actually the case that Moses had already added a bit of equity to the rule of marriage, even 1500 BC. In 1500 BC, a man was the head of the home, the wife was little better than a slave. He could dismiss her for any reason or no reason. It put her in a huge disadvantage socially. He was free to go marry again because the rules really of polygamy would allow for that, and it was no big deal. She, on the other hand, was still bound by her marriage. She was not free to remarry, and thus she was put in a horrific situation economically by this kind of rule. And Moses is actually requiring a bit of equity. If you're going to dismiss her, give her a certificate of divorce. That gives her the freedom to remarry. And by the way, you can't take her back again later. You see, so that's kind of the flavor. So even in the day, Moses is getting a little bit of an adjustment to what was going on. But the question that was really on the table at this point was, how do we construe the phrase, he has found some uncleanness in her? And there were broadly two schools of thought in ancient Israel, one rather liberal, one rather restrictive. The school of Hillel said, this is Hillel himself, quote, he may divorce her even if she spoiled a dish for him. For it's written, because he has found in her indecency in anything. He emphasized the word anything, you see. So for Hillel, you give her the certificate of divorce as Moses required, but there's really no standard otherwise that has to be met. In fact, one rabbi in that school of thought said, even if he found another fairer than she, for it is written, and it shall be if she find not favor in his eyes. So just if he wants to trade her in for a newer model, it's okay, you see, under that school. So that was one view, a lot of latitude. The school of Shammai was quite a bit more restrictive. So Shammai said, a man may not divorce his wife unless he has found unchastity in her, for it is written, because he hath found in her indecency in anything. You see the difference in emphasis there? These guys were great lawyers, And so there you have it, and everybody wondered, what does the school of Jesus say? Because regardless how Jesus comes out on this, he's going to be finding himself in conflict with somebody, and it's going to be an embarrassment, and they're really trying to sabotage his credibility because Jesus has got so much momentum going popularly, they're trying to find some way to trip him up. So it seems that's what's happening. Some, however, have thought maybe it's not so much a theological trap as a political one. Remember, they're traveling through Perea. Remember that the ruler of Perea is Herod Antipas, who had his own interesting philosophy of marriage. You remember this, don't you? He jilted his first wife, the daughter of Aretas, the king of Nabatea, to marry Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. When he was taking a little jaunt to Rome, he met her and took a liking to her. And so, he had a fairly loose standard himself. People thought, well, maybe Jesus can get himself in trouble with Antipas, and he'll never make it to Jerusalem, because he'll wind up like John the Baptist, who criticized Antipas for that very thing and wound up being beheaded. Of course, the Pharisees hadn't read the Gospel of Mark. They didn't know that Jesus would wind up being crucified in Jerusalem. They were trying to prevent a rallying of support, maybe, by preventing him from getting there in the first place. Some have thought maybe it was a legitimate question. Maybe they actually wanted to know his thoughts on it. The word test there doesn't necessarily imply hostility. One way or another, the question on the table is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? It's a perennially thorny question. The first 2 or 3 centuries of the church's history, you read these great fathers of the church, and they're very good on many topics, but they tend, I tell you, to demonize marriage. Probably the reason for that is because the institution had sunk so low in the culture that they thought it was better just to avoid the whole thing. Roman brutality, immorality, the effects of Platonism and Gnosticism and other forces caused many otherwise, wonderful Christian people to simply say, just don't do it. Live a celibate life. One guy called this curing a headache by decapitation. That's how you deal with that problem. Augustine didn't help much. I love Augustine. He's one of my favorite guys. He had lived a conspicuously immoral life before his conversion, and afterwards he solved the problem the same way. Just live a celibate life, and he actually encouraged women to live a celibate life. He doesn't have much to say that we would call kind of the standard Christian marriage that hopefully we have a sense of celebrating. The medieval church, under the shadow of Augustine, heavily emphasized the virtue of celibacy, of virginity, of singleness, and granted that marriage was kind of a necessary evil. There was an element in it called concupiscence, which was not outright sin, but was sort of a shadow, a taint. And so you only marry if you really have to, if you can't contain yourself, is the idea. But for those who are the true saints, you need to rise to a higher level. Marriage became a sacrament largely to offset the concupiscent element in marriage and sort of give a balancing indemnity there. It's not till the Reformation that we have a kind of re-engineering of marriage, and it all begins with Martin Luther. Nobody up until this point had really done it. Even people who were very much part of what's called the pre-Reformation movements really don't highlight this till it's the delightful romance between Martin Luther and Katie Van Bora and the family they established and the hospitality they extended and the picture of marriage we get from them, which became a paradigm for the entire Reformation movement from that time, including John Calvin, John Knox, the Puritans, Jonathan Edwards and his wonderful relationship to Sarah Pierpont, and so on. And really you'd say sort of marriage was reinvented at that point. The Protestant tradition thus took away the sacramental piece because it wasn't theologically required, and really in many ways made it more of a civil thing. It was recognized this is God's institution, but it was an institution that takes place at the civil level. And so interestingly and somewhat ironically, the Protestant tradition actually had more latitude for divorce historically than you would have found in the annulment theology that is common in Roman Catholic thought. It seems, this is my hypothesis, that it wasn't until the Reformation that there was really a discovery or recovery of what Jesus puts in place in this text here in Mark and parallel texts elsewhere. If I could just put it in a summary form, especially because I may run out of time again, this is becoming a habit. What Jesus does is he changes the emphasis in marriage from law to grace, from restriction to action. He changes the emphasis from concession to purpose. Not simply what is permitted, what is allowed, but what's the point of marriage? What's its fundamental reason? Why has God given us this gift? He changed the emphasis from hierarchy, a kind of authoritarianism in marriage, to equality. And it may be that's the single most dramatic part of what happens in this text. So let's see how far we can get. Jesus answers their question with a question, what did Moses command you? They answer, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce. Jesus asked what Moses commanded. They claim to revere Moses, but they sidestep the question, not answering what Moses commanded, but rather what Moses permitted. So they're thinking of the Deuteronomy text, not the original text that actually formed the institution of marriage. We know in the Old Testament God does sometimes permit things that he doesn't in a robust way approve. That's part of the accommodation, you might say. in the Old Testament. And so under those circumstances, as we saw in Moses, divorce is permitted, but it has to at least have some degree of provision, of care for the person who's being bumped out of the family, as it were. Jesus answers them and says, well, it's because of the hardness of your heart that this precept was provided for you. The Old Testament does constantly have to deal with a kind of hardness of heart of the people. The Apostle Paul says the law was a schoolmaster, literally a disciplinarian, to bring us to Christ, as it were, kind of herding the people of God down through history until the time of Messiah, when the law would no longer be engraved in stone, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, but written in the heart. It's in the heart that the motives are touched, and so our motivation is to obey God rather than the kind of straitjacket that's being imposed upon us. But in the Old Testament, that straitjacket mentality is pretty evident at various places, and Jesus seems to have something of that in mind. This was permitted because of your hardness of heart, but the law never really got into your guts. It never really got into your motives, and so it's hurting you to the time of Christ. So it represents an exception in the rule of marriage, but not the purpose of marriage, which is much earlier and much deeper. I love Jim Edwards' quote on this particular point. He said, quote, "Focusing exclusively on the exception is something like learning to fly an airplane by following the instructions for making a crash landing." You know, well, maybe it's good to know how to make a crash landing, but it's also better to know how to make a normal landing. You see, that really should be the prior education that one gets, rather than focusing right off the bat on the exceptions. Jesus now takes up the instructional part. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Several things here are dramatic for us, but even more for the people who originally heard it. First of all, from the beginning, bypassing the discussion about exceptions and going back to the fundamental creative moment. We've all been to weddings, we've heard the language, this is an institution ordained by God in the time of man's innocency. That's significant. The Bible has all kinds of institutional ideas, institutions created. There's only one, however, that is not remedial. Institutions, by and large, government and so on, are remedial because we're broken, sinful people. Marriage isn't fixing any problem. It's taking something that's good and making it better, you see. It's before the fall. It's before there was the intrusion of sin. So we're going back to a very deep level at which this marriage idea is being formulated, and we hear, first of all, that it involves a male and a female. I'm not going to jump off into this discussion except to say, at least for my part, that the whole debate about same-sex marriage needs to go back to this verse. It's male and female, and debates about marriage and so on, and its applicability in other situations, should begin under the shadow of that. There's also what's called the leave and cleave idea. This was the old King James. That's what I grew up on, you know. And you know that that, in a sense, makes the devotion, the allegiance to the wife, actually exceed duties to parents. The ancient Jewish people had it the other way around. They said a man's duty to his parents actually was higher than his duty to his wife. And so Jesus is correcting that understanding. The two shall become one. The two shall become one. This would be the sort of definitive rule in the Old Testament with regard to polygamy. Something that was indeed permitted, but never really endorsed or blessed. But it was there, and this rule, in a sense, gives greater clarity. And finally, the two are no longer two, but one flesh. This short statement is just loaded, with the deepest idea of what this institution we call marriage is all about. One flesh in the Hebrew idea would be something like saying one organism. Two become one. I don't know about you, I've got a drawer at home full of keys that I found along the way. You know how that is? You know what I'm saying? You're going through the basement, sweeping up, and there's a key. And you think, I bet that's important. I've had some keys for years. I've never found what they fit. But you don't want to throw it away. Because why? There might be someday you find the lock. And you realize that a key is really useless without a lock, and a lock isn't worth much without a key, is it? They are two quite distinct objects, and yet they are one mechanism. They don't make sense, the one without the other. That's the way, in an even deeper sense, the Hebrew understanding of being one flesh would be construed. These two people become, in some sense, one organic unity, one being, one organism. Paul says, rather understating the point, it's a great mystery. It is a great mystery. I know many of you in this room are married, many of you have been. We all have an instinct about this, however. There is something, as long as you've been married, that's still deeply mysterious about it. Something richly, wonderfully mysterious about this being united with another person in the very deepest sense of an intimate human relationship. The Jewish tradition actually had an idea about this. A midrash on Genesis 2:18 says, "He who has no wife dwells without good, without help, without joy, without blessing, without atonement." So they had it somewhere in their thinking, but the Pharisees, by the time we reached the first century, had really kind of lost track of that. So Jesus says, "What God has joined together, let not man separate." Marriage, God's creation, transcending human invention, psychology, economy, what God joins, let not man separate. Applying, first of all, of course, to the whole question of divorce, I believe, extending to all attempts to redefine marriage according to forms that don't conform to the inventor of the institution, God Almighty. Well, later, the disciples raised the question. In the house, his disciples also asked him again about the same matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." There's something going on here, what's facially going on is significant enough, but there's something else that can easily be missed. This is taking place in a house. It's a private conversation with the disciples. And Jesus says, if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. Now, adultery was a crime. It'd be like saying he commits a felony against her. In the ancient world, it was a serious crime, but it wasn't extended to divorce if you gave your wife a certificate of divorce. Jesus changes that rule. If a man divorces and remarries, he's committed a crime against her. Now, the force of that, the importance of that, is that it is elevating radically her rights, her interests, her dignity, her importance in that relationship, which was virtually ignored, you see, in the ancient marriage economy. She becomes a full participating member of this, and if she gets bumped out of the house, she's just had a crime committed against her. That's the way it was heard, and that, of course, requires some understanding of her value and her importance. So it's dramatically elevating the dignity of the wife, which had been conspicuously subservient in the ancient world. It equalizes the partners. It's as simple as that. The New Testament has an idea of the husband being the head of the home, but that's a division of labor. That has nothing to do with superiority, intrinsic superiority, anything like that. It has nothing to do with some sort of personal authoritarianism. In fact, you notice in the New Testament, the husband is never commanded to make sure his wife is in submission. Did you ever notice that? What's the command of the husband? Love. Love with the deepest, most self-sacrificing love you can imagine. The love that Christ had for us when we were hostile, when we were enemies. That's the love that Christ had for us, and that's what husbands are called to do. So irrespective of how a wife may be disposed toward him, he is to love her with love that would fall on his sword if he needed to for her welfare. The only person who decides who is the head of the house is the woman. She's the one that's told, given those injunctions in the New Testament, to recognize his headship. Many men get way off the rails because they think their private duty in life is to make sure that they pounded their husband or pounded their wife into submission. And that is not the biblical rule. She has this wonderful equality in the relationship that is to be respected. With privilege comes responsibility. This would be unthinkable in the ancient world. They would never, this was a line that would have been just novel to them. If she divorces her husband and marries, she commits adultery. You see the equalizing of it? This is so transforming to that institution, it took the church 1,500 years to figure it out. But in fact, it's all there. It is so far ahead of what was customary in the ancient world, it's still breathtaking to us. How completely outside the box is the instruction that Jesus gives us on the question of marriage and divorce and the character of how we are to understand those institutions. All right, quickly, Sunday school lesson. Number one, every rule of life that is given by God has a purpose, and we do injustice to the rule to neglect or ignore the purpose. We may find ourselves chafing at times against the rules that God gives. But if we just take the time to look behind the scenes at the purpose, then all of a sudden the rule can become much more benign, much more of something that actually gives us joy. Martin Luther had a very negative view of law. Law was basically negative. It convicts us of sin, it restrains evil. But John Calvin added what was called the tertius usus, the third use, my counselor, my friend, my pastor. The one that is actually there to encourage me in faithfulness in my life of service to Christ. And in some ways, that's what this point is trying to say. Let's make the law, the rules that God gives us, our friend, and we do that by looking for a purpose. The rule of marriage should not be separated from its purpose, which is intended for our good and for God's glory. God has given us this as a gift. It is the heart and core, as you know, of human society. It's that organism that gives rise to a family and to children and becomes the building block of a community, fellowshipping together. Some of us in this room are married, some of us are not, but all of us know somebody that's married. And part of what we are about is not only doing what is good for our own marriage and recognizing the value in that, but also doing everything we can to support and sustain and help those that we know who are also sharing in this embattled institution in our culture in these days. And finally, the principle of humble service in the kingdom begins with those closest to us. And for those who are married, that means husband or wife. For all of us, we are close to somebody, and humble service begins there. Peter says it's time for judgment to begin with the family of God. This is where we begin to apply the rules that are given us, and from then we extend it further and further out into a world that needs it.